Yes, believe it or not, by popular demand, here I am back at Janus Motorcycles of Goshen, Indiana. An overwhelming amount of you have asked me to look at their 450cc Halcyon. And I really can't avoid it any longer. I mean, dozens upon dozens of people have asked. But not only am I going to look at the 450 Halcyon, I'm going to take a look at their 250cc's as well. And you may be asking, well, why would you do that if you've already reviewed those bikes? The answer to that question is a little bit more simple than you might imagine. Well, for one thing, opinions change over time. As we grow as people, our tastes in music, maybe movies, video games, you name it, even food, changes. And like with their bikes, they're continuing to make improvements. Little things, maybe some major things, but I want to take a fair shot at them again because you never really know. I could actually fall in love with them.
I must admit, I was a little worried that the people of Janus would be apprehensive of me because I've been critical of certain aspects of their motorcycles in the past. In fact, I was literally the only one at the time to make a video on their bikes that had criticism or negative comments. But please bear in mind, and I believe they totally understood this, is that it was never done so to crap on their bikes or their business. Far from it, in fact. I had to be as honest and unbiased as humanly possible because at the end of the day, if someone is reviewing a product and it's 100% nothing but praise and gallivanting all over the product, well, it comes off as disingenuous or fake, or that I'm being paid to make the video, whatever the case may be. The past 4 years since that original video, I feel like I've aged, I don't know, like 15 years. A lot has happened since then, nearly died a few times, almost had my foot amputated, and I somehow managed to acquire a few diseases along the way. Anyway, long story short, Janus was more than welcoming to having me back to check out their motorcycles once more. My fiance and I met with the co-founder Richard and the general manager Grant, who were both extremely nice, incredibly welcoming guys that I would genuinely love to hang out with at a bar and, shoot the shit, and I don't even drink. Richard gave us a whole tour of the place, including their fabrication shop not too far away. It was a very cool experience and eye-opening because so much goes into these bikes that in the past, I really wasn't that aware of. I'm sorry, I know I'm getting carried away with all the behind-the-scenes stuff, which may be for a different video. What you guys care about is the bikes. So the goal here is going to be similar to the Royal Enfield video and the previous Janus one. I'm going to give you guys my initial first impressions of the bikes and my first-hand experience with riding them. Because I'm not familiar with the roads of Goshen, Indiana, Richard was nice enough to take me out on a route that had twists and turns, as well as areas where you could really, rip on the throttle. With that said, let's get to it. First, let's talk about the Janus 250s. You have the Halcyon and the Griffin. Unfortunately, the Cafe Racer inspired Phoenix is no longer available as it wasn't selling anywhere near the numbers of the other two models. Which is sad because of all the bikes, I loved the Phoenix the best, but then I've always been a big Cafe Racer guy, so yeah. The Halcyon is super old school in design and styling. It kind of reminds me in a way of the Indian singles from the early 1900s. One major thing you've probably have noticed is that the Halcyon doesn't have the standard, typical, traditional rear suspension that you would normally see from motorcycles, while the Griffin does. Instead, the Halcyon is a hardtail, with coils under the seat, and, well, that's all you get. The Griffin offers a completely different style compared to the Halcyon, but mechanically, it's borderline the same bike. Kind of like how Royal Enfield has a classic 350 and a Meteor, the Scram 411 and the Himalayan 411, or the GT 650 and the Interceptor 650 counterparts. The Griffin is stylized as a scrambler. It's got a high-mounted exhaust, a taller seat height, knobby tires. It's a very slick interesting looking bike with a unique, almost industrial vintage look to it. It kind of reminds me of the dual sports from the early 70s, but with somewhat of like, I guess, a steampunk look to it. The bikes come in a large variety of color options, and what's really cool is Janus has a build your motorcycle function on the website. It'll give you a better idea of what the color will look like on any given motorcycle. But if none of the colors really speak to you, you could actually request one, like an orange or a yellow motorcycle, for example. Which I have seen one yellow Halcyon in person, and it was pretty damn sharp looking if you ask me. The Janus and its small 229cc engine manages to push out 14 horsepower, a surprisingly low amount even for a small-sized engine. For reference, other motorcycles with around the same engine size like the Virago 250, Suzuki TU 250X, and even some Vespa scooters like the GTS 300 have more power to their engines, in some cases as much as double the horsepower. Although the Janus's 250s weigh barely anything, they're like only, 265 pounds. So the power to weight ratio is balanced enough to where the bike doesn't feel underpowered for its engine size. But you have to bear in mind, you wouldn't really buy any small displacement bike for that reason anyway. Yes, there are bikes like my Versys 300X that are shockingly fast for what they are. It's a bike that can go over 90 miles an hour, and it has an impressive 0 to 60 at around 6 to 7 seconds. It's a powerful engine for its size, but that bike is geared towards performance. I mean, it's the same bike mechanically as a Kawasaki Ninja. The Janus reminds me almost like a Royal Enfield in their lower displacement bikes. They're not speed demons, that is not the point of them. The Janus 250s are more commuter bikes, built to be reliable, tough, and easygoing, extremely comfortable. They're meant to withstand punishment like wide open throttle for miles and miles, while at the same time still being a easy, smooth ride. Anyway, small displacement bikes. I have just as much fun with them as I do with faster bikes, like my old Yamaha VMAX, and other motorcycles that I've been on like an Indian Chief, a Suzuki Gixxer, or a Honda Valkyrie. Sometimes I even have more fun on the smaller bikes because, well, I don't know, there's just something about going fast on a slow bike that's more enjoyable than going slow on a fast bike, let alone doing the speed limit in second gear. There's a completely different feeling to it that I can't quite explain fully. But despite not having a whole lot of power and acceleration, I was still wildly enjoying myself. I kept catching myself with this big old grin on my face, and there was even points where I was laughing because of how much fun I was having. It reminds me of the old days when I was a little boy opening up a Nintendo 64 or a PlayStation on Christmas morning. The sheer joy and excitement on my face at the time is, in a way, comparable to the joy and fun I was having while riding these bikes. I have a lot of people that ask, okay, well, what's the 0 to 60 on a bike like this? Not really so much for like a racing aspect. Instead, more of a, well, how well does it handle traffic and commutes where speed limits are around 55 miles an hour? Honestly, I don't think anyone has really tested the bike in terms of a 0 to 60. I found no information about that online. Even a dozen videos that I've watched, no one ever talked about it. So I kind of gave it a go off of a rolling start, and it was around 10 seconds. So realistically, the 0 to 60 on something like this, I would imagine, is going to be around the 11-second mark with practice. Really, it's about the exact same as it is on a Virago 250 and the Suzuki. It was basically what I expected. City roads, back roads, countrysides, a vast majority of the routes that I take to work, the stores, or even just to enjoy a ride in general, I wouldn't really see any problems with this bike. I feel like if a majority of my commute happened to deal with a lot of 55 and over streets, highways, or roads that things tend to get a little bit more busy and chaotic, that's when things might get a little sketchy. especially if you're trying to overtake or pass people in traffic. 2-lane roads probably wouldn't be that big of an issue, but I would not be super thrilled about passing someone who's doing maybe 50 and a 55 on a 1-lane road. But I would have to really take a bike like this out where I live to give a better idea if it's realistic passing power. The Halcyon and the Griffin 250s can go highway speeds of around 65 to 70 plus miles an hour, which isn't really bad when you consider a Royal Enfield 350 Classic achieves basically the same top speed. The big difference, however, is that you can tell the Classic does not like being pushed to that limit, where the Janus doesn't mind at all. In fact, it seems to crave being pushed more and more. In a weird way, it almost behaves better the more you slam on the throttle and abuse it. Also, I think because this bike is so small, it feels like you're going faster than you really are. The only thing about going highway is, well, because the bike weighs just over 260 pounds and has pretty slim tires, you do feel the gusts of wind. You definitely feel it when a car or a truck passes by you, whether it's next to you or even on oncoming traffic. It's a little daunting at first, I'm not going to lie to you, but after about, 30 minutes, you kind of get used to it. The engine of the 250s are, yes, Chinese. I've mentioned this before in a previous video. It's an air-cooled single-cylinder, carbureted engine that mimics an extremely reliable, well-made one by Honda of its same size. The topic of it being Chinese is without a doubt a subject of quite a lot of controversy and negativity. There are people out there that will flat out refuse to buy a Janus for that sole reason. In their defense, it's not like they're just buying the stuff from China or wherever and sticking it onto their bikes and charging X amount of dollars for it. It's honestly what I thought they might have done back years ago, which of course made me question the bikes, but it's not like that at all. A lot goes into these bikes that I think people don't have a single clue about. The carburetor, for example, they break the thing down, removing elements from it and replacing it with American-made parts like with the jet needle, the atomizer, among others. They even go out of their way to engrave the parts with item numbers and the Janus name. Janus assures that these engines are bulletproof and extremely reliable, and I have to take their word for it. There's very little evidence to prove otherwise. The only negative thing I've ever come across was in a YouTube comment about how their bike weeps oil, but then never once mentioned if he raised the concern with Janus or if he even fixed it. Either way, the bikes are so easy to work on that even if something does go wrong, not only does Janus provide an extensive library of tutorials, but these bikes are so simple that I can end up doing a valve adjustment on a bike like this in less time than it takes to watch the greatest show in reality TV history, Flavor of Love.
I have a drink in my hand. I will throw this drink in your face. I'm not going to shut up for you. I am not going to shut up. No, I'm sick of that. I'm sick of the energy. I'll do the bad. You're right. Because no. Oh, my goodness. That's not the world. This is bull. Shut up.
The 5-speed transmission. Okay. This was my biggest complaint that I had in the original video. In fact, I'm going to splice that part in real quick. One major thing I noticed right off the bat is the awkward transmission. It's clunky going from a dead stop to taking off, to the point where the clutch is slipping like a son of a bitch, causing you to suddenly shake back and forth. But then once it catches in gear, you hear and feel it. Afterwards, the transmission handles fine, like any other bike. What's it like now? Is it still clunky when taking off from a standstill? Does it still feel like the bike is going to stall out on me, or that the clutch is slipping, and I quote, like a son of a bitch? The answer to that is no, not really. I don't know if these bikes were broken in more, I don't know if improvements were made to the transmission or its clutch, whatever, but taking off from a standstill was noticeably smoother than ever before. Yeah, it still has a kinda weird clunkiness to it, but honestly, from my experience with carbureted motorcycles that I've been on in the past, including a newer 250 Virago and a bunch of old Viragos from the 80s and 90s, as well as various other Suzukis, Hondas, you name it, it doesn't really feel all that different from those bikes. So I'm just going to assume it's just the quirkiness of having a carbureted motorcycle. Of course, as you get going, the bike shifts like a dream. Very forgiving in the event that you have downshifted maybe a little bit earlier than you should have, and the shifts feel incredibly smooth regardless if you are going into a higher or a lower gear. The engagement point is fantastic, by the way. Simple, easy to figure out, and the clutch lever has a good pull to it. Neither is it too light, nor is it too heavy. So yeah, big fan of that. Another aspect I was initially very critical of was the brakes. That was something I flat out hated, to be honest. I didn't feel like the brakes were strong enough. They were very spongy, and I noticed I had to apply, I don't know, like 2 or 3 times the amount of pressure on both the front and the back brake than I would have to on any other motorcycle. Thankfully, Janus has responded to this by upgrading the brakes in recent years, and wow, what a massive improvement. Very responsive. Both levers felt nice as you applied the pressure. There wasn't like any sort of sponginess to them whatsoever, and the stopping power, again, night and day difference. Both of the 250s, the Griffin and the Halcyon, are comfortable, but in different ways. To give you guys an idea of my body structure, I'm roughly 175 pounds and about 5'11". The co-founder, Richard, is tall as hell at like 6'6", and rode a Halcyon from San Francisco to Brooklyn in less than a week. Both bikes fit us perfectly despite our difference in body structure. I felt entirely natural on both the Griffin and the Halcyon, although the seating position and body position of the Griffin was just a little bit better for me. The Halcyon has a hardtail seat with the old school handlebars that kind of remind me of what you get on cruiser style bicycles today. The controls are ergonomic. Everything is right there available for you. The 250s don't have a tack. They don't really need one either, though the option to have one would be kind of cool, actually. There's no questionable buttons or switches that leave you wondering, well, what the hell do those do? It's all simple. It's all very easy to figure out, and it all works perfectly. The seat of the hardtail Halcyon, if it's something you've never been on before, you might think, oh god, there's no way that's comfortable. It's actually completely fine. It's a different feeling, you know, that's for sure, and maybe it was a little bit awkward at first. However, after like 5 minutes, I didn't even think about it anymore because, honestly, it was far more comfortable than most other motorcycles I've been on recently, and that's including my Kawasaki Versys. It's such a comfortable motorcycle that even with the problems that I have with my left foot, I wouldn't have a problem riding this bike for hours and hours at a time. Now with the Griffin, the moment I sat on that bike, I felt completely at home with its seating position, body position, all of that. Everything was 1000% natural for me based off of the bikes that I've grown accustomed to. The seat on the Griffin is also very comfortable, and unlike the Halcyon, it does have a suspension system on the back. In fact, it's a pair of shocks. I found the suspension on both the front end and the rear to be perfectly fine, no issues at all, no complaints, and that goes for both the 250s. They handled great on semi-crap Midwestern roads. Like always, I don't try to throw myself into potholes or really bad terrain, especially since it's not my motorcycle, but I can't imagine that the bike's handling the typical crappy Midwestern roads, even more terrible roads out there, would be completely fine. It is an interesting ride. I can't really explain to where it makes sense. But riding a motorcycle with front leading link suspension is not the same at all as traditional motorcycle forks. But at the same time, I can't exactly say one is better than the other. I've had people assume that because the front end is essentially a pair of shocks, that the ride is going to be rough, and that's simply not true whatsoever. It's definitely a smooth ride. There was no doubt about that. There was a point though where I did accidentally hit a smaller pothole on the hardtail Halcyon, and of course, yeah, I felt it, but it wasn't bad. I expected worse from it and was surprised at how manageable it really was. I don't know if I would call it a complaint, but more of a quirk in regards to the Griffin. Well, I noticed that anytime I was going faster than, say, 45 miles an hour, the bike tends to become very twitchy towards movements. As a result, the front end would wiggle from side to side and become a little bit unstable, which you should be able to tell from the footage here. I'll admit, the first time it happened, it scared the shit out of me. I almost pissed straight up in the air. Now, of course, it's nothing like the typical death wobble from a stock Yamaha Bolt when you lay off the handlebars like this, nor is it anywhere near like the time I actually dealt with a legit tank slapper about 5 years ago and somehow managed to recover from it on the highway. That, by the way, was not fun either, as you could probably imagine. Still, the Griffin kind of sketched me out when I was going that fast. I was sure to mention it to Richard and, we swapped bikes so he could feel what I was talking about, and he assured me that, yeah, the Griffin is just a twitchy bike. He knew exactly what I was talking about. In fact, he even simulated the kind of wobble effect here. I felt a little better about that, but still, call me a little girl all you want, but that whole tank slapper from years past made me a little nervous of things like this. Then I started to run theories as to why the bike was like this. I came to the conclusion that it's probably due to the design of the motorcycle. I think because the bike is so lightweight and has a taller, slimmer design to it, on top of having those lightweight shocks on the front end instead of typically heavier telescoping forks, I think what's happening here is that there's not enough weight being applied to that front end. So as you're going faster, the front end is gradually lifting off the road, just enough to where it's causing that wobble or that twitchiness, which to me makes perfect sense why it never happened to me in lower speeds. My theory could be completely wrong. I'm just making an educated guess at the end of the day. But it does make me wonder if it is actually the cause of it. Despite that, I still really enjoyed the Griffin. I think a lot of the reason why is because it's like more of what I'm used to in motorcycles in general. And I like that this bike is dual sport capable. Thinking about it now, I almost kind of want the Griffin a hair more, simply because I want to figure out if my theory about there not being enough weight on the front end is true. Coming up with scenarios of how I can adjust this, what can and can't be done type stuff. Which then brings me to the exhaust sound. This is an aspect that I'm not in love with. Obviously, Janus has put forth a ton of time, thought, and effort into their exhaust. And you can say that about their entire motorcycles in general. Outside of the catalyst, I believe the exhausts are entirely handmade in-house. They're solid one-piece designs, so it's not like you could just remove a bolt or two and then put a slip-on exhaust like you could on most other motorcycles. It's not that the exhaust tone is bad, nor am I looking for it to sound like a straight pipe. Honda Civic. Though I do wish it had more of a punch to it. I'm sure there's a way to do that, maybe, who knows, but Janus doesn't offer any different exhaust options other than the fishtail exhaust tip and whether or not you want the pipe polished or not. Which is fine. At the end of the day, the sound of an exhaust is such a minor complaint in the grand scheme of things here. Now the moment I'm sure a lot of you have been waiting for. This beautiful red motorcycle is the Halcyon 450. I've always been a fan of bikes with bright colors, and this red definitely does not disappoint. It is eye-catching and wonderful. Visually, it's not a whole lot different from that of its little brother. The major differences are that the engine is a 450, the tires are, yes, bigger, the frame is beefier, and it has a true rear suspension on top of its hardtail. It also has a twin exhaust instead of a single. There's obviously more stuff going on here, but most people are going to probably notice those things right off the bat. It's very much the same as the 250 in overall shape, feel, and design, though of course the bike is heavier, but it only weighs around 360 pounds, which really isn't heavy at all. Oh, and one thing I have to note, because I'm sure someone's ready to make a comment about it, the rack on the back of the motorcycle is a prototype. It is not the final product. They've been testing it out on this bike in particular to make sure that it is ready to go. So the moment I sat on this bike and laid off the clutch, I noticed that the bike just wanted to go, and it wanted to do its own thing. It didn't even think twice about it. And as you start to give it throttle, the difference in power between the 250 and the 450 is immediately apparent. It is much more powerful, not like blisteringly fast. I don't even think it's technically faster than my 300 Kawasaki, but I don't think I ever recall laughing with a gigantic smile on my face the way I did when I got on the Kawasaki compared to the moment I gave this Halcyon throttle for the very first time. Take a look for yourself. Richard and I just swapped bikes, and this was, yes, my very first experience with that 450.
Nice.
Yeah, to say I was enjoying myself is a complete understatement. I was falling in love with the bike practically from this very moment. Being on about, 80 to 100 different motorcycles in my life, I can only really ever recall moments like these happening with 4 other bikes. A Yamaha VMAX, a 78 Goldwing, my C-Spec Yamaha Bolt, and an Indian Chief Dark Horse. That should tell you quite a lot, including the fact that all of these 4 bikes that I mentioned are vastly different from each other. The Halcyon 450 produces 30 horsepower, and this time it is not carbureted. In fact, it is electric fuel injection. The bike is still air-cooled, but it has additional help from its oil cooler. The engine is actually Italian-born. It is an SWM brand engine, and if you don't know the history of SWM, I highly suggest you look into it, because the brand has its history with Husqvarna, KTM, as well as BMW. The engine, yes, is manufactured in China by the company Shinrei. It's inspected and then imported by the Italian company SWM. Kinda in a way similar to how Benelli, a famous Italian brand, is owned by a Chinese company that I'm probably gonna butcher the name of, Quanjiang, who produces Benelli's motorcycles. The engine on the 450 is based off of a Honda XR400, which is also known for its ultra reliability and its willingness to take a beating and handle it completely fine. Because it's such a simplistic design, it's also really easy to work on if you ever should have to or want to work on the bike yourself. The 450 is without a doubt much more highway capable of a motorcycle. It is able to hit 90 miles an hour, and it has plenty of acceleration power to handle the higher traffic speeds of 55 to 75 miles an hour. Past that, the bike does accelerate at a much slower speed, but that's kind of to be expected from a smaller single-cylinder, non-performance-based engine. I didn't really test out any sort of 0 to 60 on this bike, primarily because I was having way too much fun as it is, and I honestly wasn't even thinking about it at the time. But I imagine it's got to be faster than 8 seconds. There's no way that it isn't. It's entirely a much more capable, well-rounded motorcycle just with its engine alone, where the 250 isn't highway capable. Really? I mean, it can do it, but again, it's a little bit sketchy. The 450 is capable of pretty much anything you want to throw at it. It handles city and highway roads like a complete dream. The Halcyon 450 also utilizes a 5-speed transmission. That's absolutely wonderful, by the way. Taking off from a standstill is buttery smooth. There is virtually no clunkiness to it at all, and shifting throughout the gears feels just perfect. The clutch lever, its engagement point, is spot on. Like I said, as you lay off the clutch, the bike just wants to go. It pulls itself forward, and as you give it gas, man does the 450 just go with it. What I thought was very bizarre is that because I physically cannot bend my left foot more than 50% compared to my right, let alone anyone else, no matter what bike, I always tend to false neutral motorcycles or pop them into neutral when I shift in the second gear. For whatever reason, I did not do that once when riding any of the Janus bikes. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything at all, but it was weird that that never happened, and it was actually very surprising for me. The 450, unlike its little brother, does have a rear suspension outside of the coils under the hardtail seat. There's actually 2 smaller shocks that are underneath the seat that's very reminiscent of the rear suspension that was used on the Vincent motorcycles from, I don't know, 80 years ago at this point, I think. I really liked the rear suspension on this bike. I mean, honestly, I didn't feel much of anything when I was hitting bumps, rougher terrain, even smaller potholes. Richard explained that the experience of riding one of these 450s is almost like gliding across the road, and yeah, it kind of does feel something like that. It's oddly one of the most comfortable bikes I've ever been on. I think it's more comfortable than some actual touring bikes that are meant to be comfortable long-term riding motorcycles. It's really weird. They chose to do things a little different with the brakes of the Halcyon 450. They gave the 450s a set of Brembos as well as steel braided brake lines. But you have to be a little bit careful because boy does this bike stop in a hurry. Coming from the 250, I sort of underestimated the power of these Brembos. At one point, I gave it a little too much on that rear brake, and I could hear the back tires skid for a second or two there. Outside of that, it's basically a beefier, faster, more well-rounded version of its little brother. Simply based off my first impressions, I'm entirely surprised by it. I really didn't think I would fall in love with this bike anywhere near as much as I did. The only thing I could possibly say that I didn't really care for, again, was the exhaust. But you're crazy if you think that that's something that's ever going to really hold me back from buying a motorcycle in general. I also should point out that the fuel capacity might be a negative for some people. All of the bikes have a 2-gallon tank, but the mile per gallon is pretty damn good. Expect to get anywhere from 60 to 75-ish mile per gallon. Realistically, I would imagine you would have to fill up around 120 to maybe 150 miles depending on how you're riding the bike. Which sounds like crap, but its range is barely any different from other bikes that I've owned like the Virago, the VMAX, the Bolt, as well as a few others. Small featherweights or even middleweight motorcycles in general usually aren't known to have massive tanks where you can go 200 plus miles per tank. Yeah, obviously there are bikes on the market that will do that, but nothing that even looks visually similar to a Janus motorcycle in any way, shape, or form. Now, let's jump on to a very important topic: the price point of these motorcycles. So, the Halcyon and the Griffin 250 will run you back around $9 grand, and that's bone stock. No other various additional upgrades to the paint, no luggage racks, LED lighting, any upgrades or options at all. I can't bullshit you, it's a lot of money. Outside of the origins of the engine, it's another reason why people are so hesitant to purchase these bikes. And look, I completely get it. I was in the mindset as well. I didn't really like the idea of spending around $10,000 for a bike with as much horsepower as a 1955 BMW Isetta. Then the more I thought about it, the more I was coming to terms with being completely fine with the price point. Consider this. They are a small business. Most of their parts are made locally or even in-house. Yes, of course, there are parts that are shipped from other parts of the world, either domestic or overseas. But with the rising costs of parts, labor, mostly being handmade and assembled in the US, and everything else that goes into running a very small business, it makes complete sense to me. Yeah, the engine is Chinese and so are a couple other components, but when you really think about it, if in the event those parts were 100% American made, I guarantee you the bikes would cost significantly more, and then you'd hear even more people complain about the cost of the bike. So either way, it's a no-win situation in that aspect. And the same thing really with the 450 Halcyon. That bike starts out at 15 grand, also with no added options, accessories, and whatever else you decide to do to it. It's a hefty price tag. No one can deny that. Hell, it cost damn near the same as a brand new economy car in some cases. Some people might ask, then why the hell would you spend that kind of money on a bike like this or the 250s? The answer to that is going to vary based on person to person. A vast majority of people, let's be honest, are buying these motorcycles for that sweet retro look, but then there are other factors involved. For me, not only do I love its unique look, I love the bare bones, minimalistic design of the motorcycles. It doesn't have all the gizmos and gadgets that other modern bikes have. ABS control, traction control, rider modes, that big old tablet-sized infotainment systems. It doesn't have any of that. These are motorcycles in their purest form. Just you, the bike, and the road without any other distractions, well, other than those driving around you. Unique bikes like the Janus draw me in because they're different and one of a kind. No one really has them around me. And I don't know if that's maybe the inner hipster in me, but I enjoy having something that no one else has. Being able to create a bike in whatever color I want and custom it out in whatever my particular style is a huge draw for me. I desire something that I know is going to put a massive smile on my face every single time I'm on it, and a motorcycle that when I get off that bike and I walk away from it, I'm going to turn my head and admire that motorcycle just once more before I walk through my front door. It's really funny how things change over time. My first go around with Janus in 2019 was a completely different experience than from what I had this time around. In the past, I had quite a few negative things to say about the bikes. I even said at one point that I didn't think the bikes were worth the money, but now I think these bikes are excellent and I'd kill to have one. They're a very niche motorcycle. They will not be for everyone, and there's nothing wrong with that. Typically, a big touring motorcycle guy or someone with a super fast sport bike is probably not going to go after a bike like this unless they know 100% exactly what they're getting out of a Janus. For those thinking about even so much as checking these motorcycles out, I do highly encourage it. It's one thing to hear me, Jay Leno, or whoever else talk about these bikes in a video, but it's a totally different thing to actually experience these motorcycles for yourself. Maybe in the future I can give one of their motorcycles a proper review, you know, have the bike for a couple days and really put it through its paces. I'm definitely open to it, but for now, that's gonna do it for this video, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Like always, I know everyone says stuff like that. Take care, and I will see you next time.